Back with Dr. Watson, continuing our former conversation. So, Doctor, when our bodies react in a fight or flight situation, how much of that is just pure reaction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So initially, it is going to be a large part that is pure reaction, because there will be times where your reaction are the only thing that keeps you safe. You know, I'll give you a perfect example. Many people will do this when they touch a hot stove. They'll reach their hand back, and after they've pulled their hand back, they say, "Hey, I just burned myself." But they smartly, the unconscious brain, in fact, you can get into the neurons, and it's called a reflex arc, and they pull that hand back before they consciously have even said, "I just touched something hot and it burned my flesh." And so there are times where we're very grateful that our unconscious is quick to react. The problem comes that our unconscious is not always accurate. In fact, it's inaccurate more often than it is accurate. And so that's why balancing becomes incredibly important. That's why we train our soldiers and our pilots and our air crew to slow down that immediate reaction and learn to logically go through the different things. A pilot will go through a boldface. Your mechanics, when something goes wrong, they'll go through their version of a boldface, a procedure that they do. Soldiers will go back to the procedures they learned in training. And that's why we train to do these things, because it's important to never eliminate that immediate reaction that comes from the unconscious, but we want to have the ability to also activate the conscious or logical mind to then take us through it with the smartest part of the brain guiding it. Doesn't completely eliminate it, but it guides the two of them. And the problem is, sometimes we find there's a counterfeit that can hijack the brain to where it does not allow the conscious mind to come in and lead that unconscious emotional reaction. That's where we get ourselves into trouble, because it's only going to be the right reaction sometimes. The rest of the time, it's going to foul up our ability to succeed. And so that's where our counterfeit comes from.
Story of my life.
So you're probably asking now, what is this counterfeit you refer to, Dr. Watson? There is a counterfeit that comes quite naturally to all of us. And the counterfeit is, it tries to imitate having to consciously work through something that makes us uncomfortable. I don't like feeling like I'm in danger and having to think, is this bear a danger to me today? Or did I screw it up again? Or does this person who I love really not love me? These are all terrible things to have to think through. And they're going to cause us a lot of discomfort and pain as we come to grips with reality from the past and what potentially could happen in the future. So we come up with a quick counterfeit to having to endure and work through the thing that is hard for us. And this counterfeit comes with a simple name, and there's going to be thousands of examples that fit under the category that I'm going to tell you. And the category is avoidance. Instead of working through the thing that's hard, which might be, let's use the example of, I messed up on tightening a bolt and I've ruined an entire engine because I over-tightened a bolt. It's a silly made-up example, but we all know the examples in the past where that has played out. And so instead of doing that, I might avoid even thinking about it. Well, the problem is, the unconscious mind is not smart. It doesn't let us tell ourselves little lies. Oh, I'm not at all worried that I over-tightened that bolt. And we tell ourselves that. But eventually the unconscious mind says, hey, no, that's not true. We are worried about this. And we can't use simply trying to not think about it. So then what do we start doing? Well, some people, that is, let me isolate and just not go to an area that could ever remind me of that. We see that a lot in PTSD. And okay, let me just not think about it. I'll isolate from that. Okay, eventually though, that little guy in the back of the brain, the emotional center, says, I don't think you heard me. We are worried about this. And so it goes. Well, eventually, isolation, distractions, all these things aren't going to work. So we get pretty desperate, and we can resolve to one of the second to largest one, which is chemicals to numb out my neurons so that I'm incapable of thinking of it. I can numb out that unconscious part of my brain. The only problem is I don't have any substances that just numb the unconscious. It numbs all or none. So what are these substances we're talking about? Street drugs, alcohol, which is a very potent numbing agent. It actually is a neurotoxin. There was just a recent study that came out in the last few weeks showing that even one drink is toxic to the neurons. And so we have other things that we could do. And then the ultimate avoidance tactic, which is the one that I'm spending a lifetime trying to prevent, is suicide. Isn't suicide, when we boil it down, nothing less than a way of us running away from our problems? And I mean that with all respect and no disrespect intended whatsoever, but boil it down to its roots, that's what it is. And so one of the things I spent my life doing is I really try to help people to say, let's not use avoidance, because there's a problem with avoidance. That part in the back of our brain is not the smart part of the brain. It just recognizes things and it thinks, I get what you're saying, and sometimes it's not what we intended to communicate, and it's saying, we're avoiding this because it's a realistic danger in this situation. And we're going, okay, here's a silly example. A combat veteran comes back from Afghanistan, and this combat veteran noticed in a market, a bazaar, if you will, that there were a bunch of people, and suddenly they all had long stick-like things, and he got ambushed. Out of the corner of his eye, what did he see? A lot of people with stick-like things. Some of them down, some of them up. And what was it? It was an ambush. And he got ambushed. He comes home now. He's in the States. It's uncomfortable thinking through the ambush and thinking, is that realistic for now? And so he doesn't want to activate fight or flight. Now, keep in mind, this is a fool's errand. What happens? That emotional center, we go into Walmart. We're in Walmart, and we notice as we're coming in, there's a van from the senior center that just pulled up, and there's a boatload of elderly ladies that are getting off there because right now laundry detergent is on sale at Walmart. Mm-hmm. So these elderly ladies come in there, and you're actually in need of some laundry detergent yourself. And you get in there, that unconscious part of your brain says, hey, I'm noticing there's a lot of people around us. It's not smart, right? It doesn't know how to make that distinction. That's what our conscious is. And it says, they all have long stick-like things. What do elderly people walk with?
Canes.
A cane. Is that the smart part of our brain? Can it distinguish between a cane and a rifle? No, that's what the frontal lobe, the conscious, is supposed to do. And because I'm not good yet at this, and I use the counterfeit to thinking through it, I say, I feel my heart racing, I feel the adrenaline, I'm struggling to breathe like I should, I must be in danger, I've got to avoid and run away. Avoiding is different than delaying. If you want to delay and say, it's not the appropriate time, place, or audience, I'll deal with it later, that's actually healthy. Avoiding is, I have no intention to analyze this later, I just want to run. And so I run out of Walmart. What did I just teach the emotional center? That was a real danger. Suddenly it goes, it was? So stores are a real danger. Now Target. Where are other places there are a lot of people? The movies. See how that starts spiraling and our brain gets hijacked because of the avoidance. the avoidance counterfeit. It gets even worse when we're talking about alcohol and drugs, alcohol especially. Because when we use alcohol, not only does it teach it that that was a real danger when it probably wasn't, it also hits our reward centers in our brain and causes that dopamine release. So not only do I get to release it, now it says, ooh, and that felt good. And so then our brain has two reasons to use the counterfeit. One, I didn't have to face the thing I've wanted to avoid. Two, that felt good. Now I want to feel good again. What's the only way I know to feel good after I start that? More of the counterfeit. So I go back to the alcohol or drugs. At that point, it becomes what scientists use a special fancy name saying an addiction. They call it habitual, meaning unconsciously you don't give your logical mind a chance to work through it, and you start immediately going to the counterfeit. That's when you are addicted and you lose control of your ability. And that's when, like it or not, you need to get professional help to put a stop to you automatically, unconsciously going to the counterfeit. My experience is you won't be able to do it alone. That's why AA, you think of Alcoholics Anonymous, they're nothing more than a group that teaches you how to activate your frontal lobe and that conscious logical thought when you are used to defaulting to the unconscious counterfeit during that time. When you boil it, it's not nearly as sexy when you say it that way, now is it? That's why sometimes you can be so good at using the counterfeit and it's so unconscious that's when we get professional help to bring it back into our awareness, back into our conscious. Every time I do this, holy smokes, that's a trigger for me to use the counterfeit because the counterfeit feels good. Let's not pretend. It feels good to drink initially. It's the long-term effects that are the problem. And so that's where the professional help comes in. And that's where, after the deeper you get into that addiction, the more your brain is hijacked and saying, let me avoid because everything's a real threat now and it feels really good to avoid. So you can see where that's a double-edged sword. So, did I explain it or did I talk in circles?
No, good. Yeah, really good.
All right, Dr. Watson, how much control does an individual have during the hijacking?
So initially, before we start using the avoidance heavily, a person has a lot of control. The majority of the control would be for them to be able to say, slow myself down before I use the counterfeit or the avoidance, and I'm not going to let you hijack me, pure emotion, and they can balance that logic. So early on to using the counterfeit, it's about a 50-50. Once it starts getting to the point that we are dependent on the avoidance tactic, and that can be alcohol, that can also be a video game that distracts us from dealing with our struggles we have in life. That could be sports. We've seen some people that use sports as a distraction in that. Once we get to the point that we can't live without that, now it has control of us, and we need professional help. And so it starts with you're in control of that hijacking, and the truth be known, all of us in some area of our life are going to have a little bit of the hijacking, but as long as you remain in control, you can say, I recognize what's going on, stop, I'm taking control again, we're good to go. You want to intervene somewhere around that 50-50 long before it's in control and you're just along for the ride. And we've all seen we're in control along for the ride. And sadly, work will be the last place to go for us. So it's really important to know, if you are starting to see your counterfeit is affecting your work life, that means everything else in your life is likely already on, is misfiring a little, using an old analogy. You're already misfiring in most other places of your life. it's time to get help if it's reached getting to your profession. And so at that point, you no longer have control, no matter what little lie we tell ourselves. I have control, nobody. No, if it's affecting your job, I'm sorry, but thus far I've only seen 100% of the time when it hits your work, you need help.
Very good. So how much of that control then is perceived?
The control that is perceived, it's going to depend on the person. Somebody who has engaged with help, whether that be a support group, whether that be watching videos like the ones you're doing here, this oftentimes brings people's ability to perceive what's really going on to the forefront. Somebody who has not had the blessing of having this type of thing, their perception of control is going to be much higher than is reality. There was actually a study done years ago, and they did a study and they looked at it and they said, we want people to tell us how accurate their perceptions are. And so what they did is they took a group of people and they had them take a test, and it was a technical test, and then they had them rate themselves how well they did on this test. And the better the people did on the test, the more competent the people were to scoring, getting things correct, the more accurate they were in predicting what their score would be. And the more naive the people were, meaning they had no clue what the answers were, they actually scored themselves way better than their actual score was going to come out when it was corrected. And so it is, as you are less, the old saying is, you don't know what you don't know. And we find that to be true. So the perception is, the more you've been educated through support groups, through reading, through honest reflection, these types of things, or even professional help, the more accurate your perception is going to be. The less you've had exposure to this, the more inaccurate your perception of how your world is going to be. And that's one reason that I said, I gave the key there. If it's affecting your work, you're actually almost completely out of control. And even if you thought you were in control, don't get fooled into being one of those people who scores themselves on the test way better than their score actually is going to come out. Does that make sense?
Because you don't know what you don't know.
Because and it's funny. That's why when people say there is no replacement for experience, boy, that's a true statement, because experience is what gives you that perception and the accuracy of that.
Awesome.
Can we disarm the hijacker?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, if we couldn't, what a terrible world we live in. And I'll give you an example. I had a gentleman come to me. Much of the PTSD is much of this. It's avoiding instead of working through. And when that emotional center is the only part of your brain, for all intents and purposes, that's working, the frontal lobe never does, that is essentially PTSD. I'm simplifying a touch, right? But that's neurologically what PTSD is. I got a gentleman from a specialty PTSD center they sent me, and they had diagnosed him with early onset, the equivalent of early onset Alzheimer's dementia. It wasn't Alzheimer's, it's called a neurocognitive disorder, unclassified. So, but in real people words, it's like early onset Alzheimer's. He was getting lost while he was driving. His wife was having to drive. So I did special memory tests, and he came out, and they said, actually, he's able to make and recall and do new memories. It's something else stopping his brain from functioning correctly. And so through additional testing, I said, this is PTSD, and I'm going to treat him. And so I saw him for 10 sessions. At the end of 10 sessions, he had gotten such good control of recognizing when the counterfeit was going to hijack his ability to think, he no longer needed me. Wow. And his wife actually, I'll never forget this. It's one of those moments where you kind of think back. His wife came and gave me a big hug, and normally I try to avoid hugging other people's wives, but in this case it was appropriate, and she was just sobbing and said, you gave me my husband back. And I had a couple other physicians that took over care as I had to move and go do my military service. And the other physicians said, hey, I have a message here from a person who wanted you to have it. And I said, okay. And they said this person's name, and I said, oh my goodness, how is he doing? They said, he wanted you to know he just graduated with his bachelor's degree. He started a business, and it's very successful. So he had gone from being so hijacked that he was struggling with getting lost while driving. His mind was that, he'd lost that much control for such, and his entire thing was avoidance. And thank goodness I had been a combat veteran myself to where I could say, knock it off, this isn't what we do. And this old Marine said, well, if the Army can do it, the Marines can do it. And so he kept working, and after 10 sessions of really intense stuff, he no longer needed me because he had regained control of that hijacked mind. Now, that is quite a dramatic. I wish I could say every one of my patients are quite that dramatic, but he was willing to work hard enough that, yes, in spite of being diagnosed as early onset Alzheimer's type dementia, he had regained that much back in his ability to take control over his own mind again. And he told me, he actually said to me, I hated you, Doc. I hated you because you would never let me avoid. And I literally would curse you when I went home. And then he actually started crying and said, thank you for not letting me avoid. But that's how much professional help can actually help us. If you're being hijacked by alcohol, that's your only avoidance, you can get over it through support groups as well as professional training. If this old Marine could get over it with an old Army guy's help, well, anybody could get over it. Even if it's street drugs or alcohol or many times PTSD is intermingled with substance use disorders. And so any of this is there. It's as long as you have a mind that can still think, it's not too late. You can be helped by professional help. But it's gonna be hard. You may hate me at first. That's what my guy told me. And then he was very grateful at the end. Did that answer?
It did, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great example. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for watching our videos. We're with Dr. Watson of Recovery Ways. I'm Tony Lepore of Local 591.
And Ken Morse from Local 591. Thank you all for watching.